They once lined every pantry like quiet lifelines, foods that defied time, trusted by those who'd seen it all and lost even more. What secrets did our grandparents bury with the meals they stockpiled? And why did we let them vanish? Molasses was never just sweet. For your grandparents, it was medicine, barter, a stain remover, and yes, even shoe polish. Sealed in rusted metal tins that somehow outlasted generations, this thick black syrup sat in pantry corners like a bottled relic of harder days. It was sticky, slow, and steady, like the lives that depended on it. During the Great Depression and wartime years, molasses was cheaper than sugar and far more forgiving. It was poured into bread dough, stirred into cough remedies, and even slathered onto boots to survive one more winter. No one bought it for fun. They bought it because it worked. Those who knew how to stretch a spoonful across 5 meals understood what it meant to make do. That tin was not just a container. It was a promise. A promise that flavor, healing, and survival could still come from one humble shelf. Most of us today would not know what to do with a gallon of it, but back then, molasses was a lifeline. Hardtack did not pretend to be soft. These crackers were survival baked into bricks. Soldiers bit them, sailors soaked them, and grandparents stored them. World War II may have ended, but the leftover rations stayed, stacked in basements and bunkers long after the siren stopped. Not for days, not for weeks, but for decades. Your grandparents knew that if things ever got that bad again, they had backup. Some folks today have found boxes unopened since the 1940s, and guess what? Still edible. That is not food, that is foresight. Sure, you might need a hammer or a hot bowl of broth to soften it up, but the fact that it still exists tells you something. Our ancestors did not trust the future, they trusted preparation. One hardtack cracker could outlive a marriage, a war, even an entire government. And it did. This was not about taste, it was about security. Biting into one was like biting into the past. Dry, tough, but dependable. The kind of food you hope you never need, but keep anyway, just in case. Dehydrated potato flakes were the powdered miracle nobody saw coming. They arrived in wartime boxes with faded labels and strict instructions, as if instant food required discipline. And maybe it did. These flakes were not just for convenience. They were military issue, battlefield fuel, and ration card gold. You would pour in hot water, stir, and just like that, mashed potatoes without a farm in sight. Families clung to them when real potatoes were either too expensive or completely unavailable. Grandmothers made them taste like Sunday dinner with a little butter and salt, while children scarfed them down because they were warm and filling. Even after the war, those boxes never really went away. They slid into pantries and onto shelves, waiting silently for the next crisis. And in homes that remembered leaner years, those flakes became tradition. Rehydrated, they puffed up like a memory. Flat to full, empty enough. And they are still made the same way today. Canned brown bread sounds like a punchline until you have lived through winters with no oven and no power. In New England, it was not a joke. It was dessert, dinner, and backup food in a single can. Baked right inside the metal, the bread would slide out in a dark, dense cylinder. Moist, sweet, and somehow still good. It is made with molasses, whole grains, and a stubborn kind of magic that refuses to spoil. Families passed down cans like heirlooms. You sliced it cold or steamed it in a pot, served with beans or just plain butter. And no, it did not look like the soft sandwich bread we are used to. It looked like something you would find on an old ship or in a miner's lunch pail. Because that is exactly where it came from. The bread did not need a fridge. Still edible. Still standing. In a world obsessed with freshness, this stubborn little can of bread was a quiet rebellion. It was the food equivalent of a handwritten letter, slower, denser, more real. Wax-dipped cheese wheels were not just delicious, they were strategic. Before refrigeration, cheese was preserved like treasure, sealed in thick wax and left to rest in cool cellars for years. Yes, years. Your grandparents did not slice into them casually. These wheels were planned, protected, and portioned like gold. Sharp cheddar or aged Gouda would be wrapped in cloth, soaked in wax, and set aside, just in case. Because cheese was not a snack, it was a ration, it was survival. Even today, people find waxed wheels that have aged for a decade, and they are still edible, sometimes better than before. That is the magic of wax and patience. When storms came or crops failed, that cheese was there. It melted into sauces, it topped stale bread, it became dinner. In a world of expiration dates, this little wax-covered miracle said, "I will be ready when you are." Jars of beef drippings, schmaltz or lard, were not just fats. They were gold. Rendered from the toughest cuts of meat, these jars sat on kitchen counters and in pantries like silent guardians of survival. During rationing years, fat was not just a luxury, it was essential. Schmaltz added flavor to everything, from vegetables to bread. It was a base for soups, stews, and sauces, transforming simple dishes into something hearty and comforting. While many of us today throw out every last bit of fat, back then, not a drop was wasted. People knew that this rendered fat could be used in 100 different ways, and it never went bad. Stored properly, it could last for years without refrigeration. It was the safety net for families when fresh meat was scarce and fresh butter even scarcer. The best part? That rich, golden sheen on top of the jar, the mark of perfect rendering. Rock-hard ribbon candy sat untouched in Grandma's dish for years. Its layers solidified into a fortress of sugar. Sweet, sticky, and unyielding, this candy was a symbol of how much longer things used to last. People back then didn't just eat candy. They stored it, they savored it, they knew how to make it stretch. In a world where food was often rationed, every morsel mattered. The ribbon candy was made by hand, folded in intricate patterns, and stored away for holidays or special occasions. But its real value came from its resilience, not just to the weather, but to time itself. It could sit for decades on a shelf, turning rock-hard and sticky with age. And even then, it still had a taste that took you back to simpler days. It was a candy of endurance, a confection that somehow, through sheer force of will, survived everything: wars, rationing, and the inevitable passage of time. If you were lucky, Grandma would offer you a piece when you visited, and even if it was as hard as a rock, it was a taste of something from another era. Homemade vinegar, with the mother still growing, was more than just a kitchen staple. It was a living legacy passed down in cloudy jars from one generation to the next. At the bottom of those amber bottles, the mother would swirl, a strange, jellyfish-like mass that carried on the fermentation process like a quiet alchemist in the dark. Families used this raw, unfiltered vinegar for everything from preserving vegetables to treating wounds and cleaning floors. It was pungent, powerful, and patient. You did not buy it at the store. You nurtured it in a cool, dark cabinet, sometimes for years. The longer it aged, the stronger it grew. It was alive in a way most food no longer is, breathing through generations, sustaining health, and carrying a tang of old-world wisdom. Some believed the older the vinegar, the better it worked, for digestion, for healing, even for warding off illness. And through it all, the mother remained. Fruitcakes soaked in brandy or rum were once the crown jewels of holiday tables, dense, rich, and packed with so much alcohol they could outlive the people who made them. These cakes were not baked for freshness. They were made to last, wrapped tightly in cloth and stashed in tin boxes, sometimes forgotten for years until rediscovered like edible treasure chests. Grandmothers knew the secret. Fruitcakes got better with time, their flavors deepening as the brandy seeped in and preserved everything inside. Every slice tasted like memory, of snowy Decembers, of distant voices in candlelit kitchens, of laughter held tight in an airtight world. It was more than dessert. It was tradition, defiance, and preservation in a world that changed too fast. And somewhere, there is still a cake waiting, older than most of us, still moist, still potent, and still whispering stories through its syrupy crumb. Root cellar rutabagas and turnips packed in sand were the secret soldiers of winter survival, a preservation method so simple it is nearly forgotten today. Back before refrigeration, families relied on the cool, steady temperature of root cellars and the insulating power of sand to keep their vegetables firm, fresh, and edible for months. Rutabagas and turnips, both rugged and unglamorous, were ideal candidates. They were buried in crates of sand like hidden treasure, placed carefully so they would not touch, allowing each to breathe and rest in its gritty bed. The result? Vegetables that emerged in the dead of winter still crisp and ready to roast, boil, or mash. This method required no electricity, no glass jars, no boiling water, just patience and knowledge passed down like folklore. It was a quiet ritual, done each autumn with care and reverence for the cold months ahead. And when the first snow came, those sand-packed crates became a lifeline, a reminder that even in the hardest times, nature provided if you knew how to listen and how to store. Mason jar eggs preserved in water glass were once the farmstead's secret weapon. This old-fashioned preservation method kept eggs safe through even the harshest winters. The process was simple. Eggs were submerged in a mixture of water glass, sodium silicate, and water, then stored in cool, dark places. By sealing the eggs, they stayed fresh for months, sometimes even up to a year. This method allowed farmers to stockpile eggs when they were plentiful, stretching their availability through leaner times. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it worked, each jar a testament to the ingenuity of those who knew how to make their food last. The eggs inside would often turn a little cloudy, but they were still edible, often used for baking or scrambled breakfasts. They were the difference between a meal and a missed one. In a time where it was hard to imagine tomorrow, these jars held on to yesterday, preserving the past for the future. Campbell's soup in metal labels was the comfort food of generations and still sits, waiting to be consumed. Originally created for storm seasons or as a long-term pantry item, these metal-labeled cans were stocked for emergencies. They could last long past their expiration date, providing quick nourishment when families needed it most. The tin can itself was a marvel of preservation, sealing in flavor and preventing spoilage even when food was scarce. Campbell's soup wasn't just for sickness. It was a quick meal solution during power outages, bad weather, or any time a hot meal felt impossible to prepare. The soup came in different flavors, but all were designed to last, easy to open, and satisfying on cold nights when a warm meal was nothing more than a distant hope. Today, you might find cans of these soups lingering in old cupboards, forgotten yet somehow still useful. They've outlived their original purpose, serving as a reminder of how people got by in uncertain times. Desiccated coconut in metal tins was a wartime dessert helper that never gave in to age. It was a dry, sweet substitute that stretched over time, and people used it in everything from cakes to cookies when fresh coconut wasn't available. These metal tins were filled with flakes of coconut that stayed dry and fresh for years, preserved through war shortages and rationing. People bought them not just for flavor, but as a lasting option when fresh fruit was in short supply. What made it even more fascinating was how it never spoiled. Despite being packed in metal tins, it would sit in pantries for years, and when needed, it was just as good as the day it was sealed. Even today, some people still find these old tins tucked away in attics or cupboards, remnants of wartime resilience. The sweet flakes are more than just a culinary ingredient. They are part of a forgotten history, the taste of survival wrapped in a metal can. Honey crystallized in glass jars is one of the few foods that never truly spoils. Stored in sealed jars, honey becomes a natural time capsule, able to last for centuries when kept in the right conditions. As it ages, honey naturally crystallizes into a solid form, but it doesn't go bad. In fact, it becomes even more of a marvel with time. Ancient pots of honey have been discovered in tombs, and jars of honey are still usable after decades. For your grandparents, honey wasn't just a sweetener, it was a life-saving food during times of illness or famine. It was used to soothe sore throats, heal wounds, and provide energy when it was too difficult to prepare a meal. The honey, sitting in its glass jar, might have become hardened over the years, but it was still good. Canned deviled ham and potted meat were once the undisputed kings of lunchboxes and pantry shelves. Long before gourmet spreads became fashionable, these meats were essential in getting a family through the day. The deviled ham, carefully canned, was the go-to for sandwiches, snacks, and even a last-minute supper when the cupboard was bare. Potted meat, often a mix of ham, beef, or chicken, was seasoned to perfection, stored in a tightly sealed can, and ready to use whenever needed. These products had the uncanny ability to last for months, even years, without spoiling. In a time when food could be scarce and unpredictable, deviled ham and potted meat represented both convenience and reliability. They were affordable protein sources designed to endure long periods without refrigeration, making them ideal for emergencies or long trips. Home-canned dandelion greens were once a staple of frugal homegrown meals during tough times. People turned to their backyards and fields, harvesting these bitter greens that grew abundantly in the spring. Dandelions, often seen as weeds, were packed with nutrients and could be turned into a variety of dishes, from soups to salads and everything in between. They were easy to preserve, too. With a little salt, vinegar, and the right canning techniques, dandelion greens could last long past the season in which they were picked. The bitter taste, while off-putting to some, was often valued for its ability to stimulate the appetite and aid digestion. During the Great Depression, when every meal had to be stretched and every resource used to its fullest, dandelions became an invaluable food source. Their ability to grow wild, uncaring of the hardships of the world around them, made them the perfect symbol of survival. Today, few people remember the art of canning dandelion greens, but for those who lived through those times, it was an essential practice for keeping hunger at bay. They didn't need a store to survive. They just needed to look to the earth. Instant coffee packets from ration kits were a simple but highly effective way of bringing a little normalcy into chaotic wartime days. When fresh coffee wasn't always available, soldiers and civilians alike turned to these small packets of powdered magic that could be stirred into hot water for a quick pick-me-up. The convenience of instant coffee, paired with its long shelf life, made it a perfect solution for wartime rationing. Soldiers carried these packets with them as part of their standard-issue kit, and civilians stashed them in their homes as a form of comfort and familiarity. During the Great Depression and World War II, when access to certain luxuries was severely limited, instant coffee gave people a sense of continuity. It wasn't the rich, freshly brewed coffee many had known before, but it was a taste of something familiar, a reminder of mornings past when coffee was brewed from beans, not powdered packets. The packets themselves were often plain, no-frills packaging, meant to serve one purpose: to provide a quick, drinkable cup of coffee during trying times. Pickled beets in wax-sealed jars were another culinary relic of a time when preservation was an art. The rich, earthy flavor of pickled beets, paired with the sharp tang of vinegar, was a perfect combination for surviving harsh winters and meager rations. Beets, a hardy root vegetable, could be stored in jars and sealed with wax, making them safe from spoilage for months, even years. The process was simple. Cook the beets, slice them, and pack them in jars with vinegar and sugar, then seal them with wax to create an airtight seal. This technique allowed families to enjoy the sweet and sour taste of beets well beyond their growing season. During the Great Depression and World War II, when fresh produce was hard to come by, pickled beets were a welcome addition to the dinner table. They could be served as a side dish, added to salads, or even eaten straight from the jar. Over time, the tradition of pickling beets became a part of everyday life. Powdered gelatin in envelopes was the secret ingredient behind a generation's worth of jiggly, sweet desserts. Available in small, inexpensive packets, powdered gelatin revolutionized the dessert world during the early to mid-20th century. Its ability to transform into a solid, wobbly mass with the addition of boiling water and sugar made it an instant favorite for family meals, celebrations, and everything in between. During the Depression and World War II, when sugar and flour were often rationed, gelatin was a convenient and affordable alternative for making sweet treats. It didn't require much to prepare, and it lasted, making it perfect for a world where resources were scarce. People could stretch a little gelatin powder into a massive batch of dessert, feeding a family without breaking the bank. It was used in everything from colorful Jell-O molds to layered desserts, brightening up the dinner table when other treats were out of reach. Bouillon cubes wrapped in foil were a lifesaver during times when food needed to be as compact and versatile as possible. These small, salty cubes, often wrapped in foil to preserve their freshness, were used to create rich, flavorful broths with minimal effort. During both the Great Depression and World War II, bouillon cubes were essential for making soups, stews, and sauces when fresh ingredients were in short supply. The foil wrapping ensured that the cubes could be stored for long periods, sometimes even years, without losing their potency. Their concentrated form allowed people to stretch their limited food supplies further, turning a few vegetables or some leftover meat into a hearty meal. Not only were bouillon cubes practical, but they were also a symbol of resilience, a reminder of the importance of resourcefulness when faced with scarcity. The fact that these small cubes could add such depth of flavor to otherwise simple dishes made them invaluable during tough times. Home-dried apple rings hung in the attic evoke images of fall harvests and the old ways of preserving fruit before modern conveniences. Farmers, homemakers, and even city dwellers who had access to an attic would hang apple rings on strings to dry in the cool, dry air. The dried apples would be used throughout the winter, providing a sweet, tart snack or a key ingredient for pies and sauces. Apples were sliced thinly, often cored, and then strung up to dry naturally in the warmth of the attic. This method, which took several days or even weeks, required patience, but ensured that the apples would last through the harshest months. As they dried, their sugars would concentrate, making them even sweeter. The dried apple rings could be eaten as they were, soaked to rehydrate, or used in baking. This preservation method had been passed down through generations and was an essential part of old-fashioned food storage. The sight of apple rings hanging from the rafters was a sign of a well-stocked pantry, ready to face the months ahead. In today's world of quick fixes and modern technology, this method feels like a forgotten art, a connection to a time when food preservation required both knowledge and patience. Canned corned beef hash was a quick and easy meal option that found its way into countless American kitchens, especially during the 1940s. Often served for breakfast, corned beef hash combines chopped corned beef, potatoes, and seasonings, all sealed inside a can to preserve freshness. It became an especially popular dish during wartime when meat was scarce and families had to make do with what they could. Canned corned beef hash offered an affordable, shelf-stable option that could feed a family without much effort. All one had to do was heat it up and serve, making it a go-to choice for busy mornings or for those without the time or resources to prepare a traditional breakfast. The canned version had the added benefit of lasting for months or even years, making it perfect for storing in case of emergencies or during periods of food rationing. Baking powder from World War II. Baking kits was a quiet hero in kitchens during a time of limited ingredients. When rationing took hold during World War II, everyday items like baking powder became hard to find. As a result, baking kits became incredibly important. These kits would often include not only the baking powder, but also other essentials like flour, sugar, and sometimes even canned milk. Despite being stored for long periods, it was often still effective after decades, a testament to its long shelf life. The WE-era baking kits were more than just an assortment of ingredients. They were a reminder of the resilience of people who, even in the face of scarcity, managed to keep their kitchens stocked and their homes filled with the warmth of homemade bread and cakes. Baking powder was a small luxury that became a significant part of everyday life, allowing families to create meals that offered comfort and a sense of normalcy amidst the turmoil of war. Paraffin-waxed preserves with cloth lids were an essential preservation method before the advent of modern sealing technology. In the early 20th century, people often used paraffin wax to create airtight seals for jars of homemade jams, jellies, and fruit preserves. This method allowed food to be safely stored for extended periods, keeping it fresh through the winter months and beyond. The process involved pouring melted paraffin wax over the surface of the preserves inside the jar, which would then solidify, forming a protective seal. The wax created an airtight barrier that kept out air and bacteria, ensuring the preserves stayed fresh for months or even years. It was an affordable, practical solution for families who relied on homegrown fruits and vegetables to get through the winter. These wax-sealed jars are often nostalgic reminders of a time when preserving food was an art. Today, while most people turn to modern canning methods, the paraffin-waxed preserves remain an iconic symbol of homegrown harvests, simple ingredients, and the timeless methods of food preservation. Homemade jerky in cloth sacks was the original convenience food for pioneers and settlers. Sun-dried and smoked, this portable protein source was perfect for long journeys or uncertain times. Before refrigeration, people relied on methods like smoking, drying, and salting to preserve meat for months on end. The cloth sacks, often handmade or repurposed, would hold strips of jerky, which were meticulously hung on lines or strung up in smokehouses to cure. The process involved careful attention to the meat, whether beef, venison, or even elk, to ensure it dried properly, preserving both its flavor and nutritional value. Jerky was also a symbol of self-sufficiency, a way for families to survive without modern conveniences. It could be eaten as is or used in stews, soups, and other hearty meals. Despite its toughness, jerky was a staple in many homes and remains an enduring symbol of pioneer resilience. The tradition of making jerky passed down through generations, maintaining its place as a beloved and practical food. Canned fig preserves from victory gardens were a sweet, rich treat that spoke to the resourcefulness of families during times of war and hardship. Victory gardens, those homegrown plots of vegetables, fruits, and herbs, provided families with a sense of independence and food security during World War II. Figs, known for their sweetness and long shelf life, were often harvested in abundance and preserved in syrup, ready for any occasion. These preserves became a symbol of both abundance and scarcity. A jar of fig preserves represented the efforts of a family to provide for themselves in a world where fresh food was scarce and rationing was in full swing. Figs themselves, being hardy and productive, were the perfect fruit for preserving in syrup, and they could be used in everything from pies to as a topping for toast. Canning fig preserves was a labor-intensive process, but one that paid off in the long run, providing families with the comfort of sweetness during difficult times. Old Spice tins of ground cinnamon were more than just an aroma or flavoring. They were part of the fabric of life in many homes, where the smell of cinnamon often mingled with the warmth of baked goods. The tins themselves were a charming artifact with their vintage design and easy-to-store nature. For decades, they housed ground cinnamon, an essential ingredient in everything from cakes to stews to toothache remedies. While cinnamon's primary role in the kitchen was as a spice, it was also valued for its medicinal properties. In times when pharmacies were less accessible, families turned to spices like cinnamon for natural healing. A little sprinkle on a sore tooth or mixed into a hot drink was thought to help with various ailments. The Old Spice tins, often kept for reuse, became symbolic of the practical, resourceful spirit that prevailed in every household. They weren't just containers for a spice. They were a sign of self-sufficiency, of making do with what was available. Sorghum syrup in stoneware jugs was a staple of the rural South, where sugarcane was abundant, and every family had their own methods for creating this sweet, golden syrup. Sorghum syrup, often made from the juice of the sorghum plant, was a prized commodity during the fall harvest. It was typically stored in large stoneware jugs, which helped maintain its freshness and flavor long after the harvest season. This thick, molasses-like syrup was used as a sweetener for biscuits, pancakes, and even poured over hot cornbread, making it an integral part of Southern breakfasts and desserts. The syrup's rich, earthy taste was a reminder of the time and effort it took to harvest and process the sorghum, a labor-intensive process passed down through generations. Sorghum syrup was not only a symbol of Southern hospitality, but also a mark of self-sufficiency. Families would spend hours in the fall to boil the sorghum juice down into syrup. and the results were both a reward and a necessity for the months to come. Today, sorghum syrup, particularly when stored in stoneware jugs, is a cherished part of Southern culinary tradition, a taste of history that continues to evoke fond memories of simpler times. Canned Vienna sausages for emergency dinners were once a pantry staple, offering an easy, shelf-stable solution to a quick meal when times were tough. These tiny, salty sausages, packed in cans and often accompanied by a bit of their own salty broth, became a go-to meal during both the Great Depression and World War II. The compact size and long shelf life of Vienna sausages made them ideal for families that needed to stretch their food supplies or keep a few items on hand for unexpected guests or emergencies. Despite their humble and sometimes unappetizing reputation, they were a lifeline when fresh meat was out of reach. Whether eaten straight from the can or added to stews and casseroles, canned Vienna sausages were a reliable, if not glamorous, food source. Their small size and easy-to-store nature made them an ideal component of any emergency pantry. In many households, the phrase emergency dinner became synonymous with Vienna sausages, a reminder of times when survival often came down to making the best of what you had. Bags of dried navy beans from government aid boxes were the quiet backbone of survival during the Great Depression, humble, hard, and seemingly eternal. These beans were not flashy or flavorful on their own, but they were dependable. They came in coarse cloth sacks stamped with bold government lettering, handed out as rations to families who had lost nearly everything. People soaked them overnight, boiled them slowly, and turned them into stews, soups, and simple suppers that stretched across days. A single bag could feed a family all week if you knew how to season and stretch. They were cheap, they were filling, and best of all, they never went bad. Even today, unopened bags from that era have been found in forgotten basements, still viable after decades in the dark. These beans were more than food. They were a symbol of endurance. In those dusty sacks lived quiet resistance to hunger, to poverty, to giving up. Another powdered mix that got really popular was all the kinds of lemonade mixes that started popping out during this stretch of the 20th century too. By 1927, you had the first ever Kool-Aid, courtesy of Edwin Perkins. It didn't really get widespread appeal until the war, since it was right during this time that it became a part of those food relief campaigns. Even by the company itself, it was always marketed as one of the cheapest drinks you could get. Plus, toddlers were massive suckers for those colorful packets they always had on display at stores. If you want to go a bit further than the conventional, then you have a lot of local lemonade brand mixes to look forward to as well. There were all kinds of people who were attempting their best to try to get more vitamin C because the Dust Bowl had also happened shortly before the Second War. Combined with how poorly people were living, it meant that skin issues were pretty much a regular fact of life for people. Evaporated apples came to the rescue when the orchard was empty and fresh fruit was a distant memory. These dried slices were a Depression-era treasure, lightweight, shelf-stable, and could take a plain dish and make it special. During the cold months, fresh produce was scarce, and a jar of evaporated apples was worth its weight in gold. Evaporated apples could be rehydrated in water and turned into pies, crisps, or cobblers, bringing the essence of autumn to winter tables. In addition, they were also a sweet addition to oatmeal, pancakes, or even savory stews. Evaporated apples were different from canned fruits. They didn't need sugar or preservatives and were an affordable and natural choice for frugal families. The resourcefulness of the drying process itself was a testimony. Apples were often sliced thinly, and families would place them out in the sun or hang them on strings to air dry. Even bumper crops didn't go to waste with this low-tech method. The flesh and the core of every apple were used. Dried apples are today a popular snack, but during the Great Depression, they were a symbol of ingenuity. Turkey tetrazzini was a mid-century Italian-American delicacy back in the day. In 1950s through the 1980s, upscale New York City restaurants, including Mama Leone's and Sardi's, featured tetrazzini on the menu. It was a creamy pasta bake made with turkey, mushrooms, and sometimes peas, all coated in a rich white sauce and baked until bubbly. This dish was named after Italian opera singer Luisa Tetrazzini. In some variations, egg noodles were used instead. This dish was a popular way to use up leftover turkey, particularly after Thanksgiving, and it became a beloved comfort food in many American households. Today, it's less common to find it on dinner tables, but for those who remember it, turkey tetrazzini is a nostalgic reminder of family meals and holiday leftovers. Let's just forget about steak dinners. Canned fish was really the MVP during the Great Depression. Cheap and convenient protein for families on razor-thin budgets came in the form of sardines, salmon, and even mackerel, which found their way onto dinner tables across America. The ultimate grab-and-go meal was sardines packed in oil or water, straight from the can, smashed onto bread, or spread with a little mayo and a lot of hope they could be eaten. Canned salmon was a heartier option for casseroles, patties, and soups, stretching one can to feed an entire family. The salty, slightly fishy flavor wasn't for everyone, but when you were hungry, you didn't complain. There were other advantages to canned fish as well. It was shelf-stable, good for months without refrigeration, and small enough to transport. A favorite with travelers, hobos, and relief workers, it was a meal that even the most transient lives could count on. Canned fish is still around today, but it's not what it used to be. But in the 1930s, it was a lifesaver, showing that even the smallest catches could mean the biggest difference when times were tough. What germ was one of the best parts of the entire kernel of wheat in general? It was that embryo that was loaded with all kinds of nutrients, and neither the people nor the government was going to miss that opportunity. They popularized it as one of the most highly nutritional foods you could get your hands on during the war, especially because of it being a source of rare vitamins like E. Wartime usage meant that there was an extreme amount of use for germ. But how were people using it? Well, lots of wartime recipes that would instead call for flour, or carbs like bread, would instead use wheat germ. Lots of people managed to make enough granola to run around one household at least with a good supply of wheat germ. It also helped lots of people bake things they otherwise couldn't. One of the better parts of being able to cook different kinds of things like that is that people started to remember that cooking was also a hobby for them, a way to let some steam out and take the edge off. Plus, wheat germ was also really good at giving you some much-needed protein, which was something people wanted to be putting in their diets as much as they regularly could, to be honest. The Depression-era workhorse of the pantry was cracked wheat, which turned simple grains into meals that fed body and soul. This unassuming staple was cheap, hearty, and endlessly adaptable, a lifeline for families trying to stretch a dollar. Cracked wheat was boiled into a porridge-like breakfast, used in place of pricier grains in bulk soups, or simply used as a cheap alternative to pricier grains. This coarse, nutty grain wasn't just filling, it was packed with nutrition, providing a steady supply of fiber, protein, and vitamins. It stored beautifully in burlap sacks, ready to rescue meals when other ingredients ran out, and its long shelf life made it ideal for stockpiling. Cracked wheat was baked into bread or stuffed into vegetables to make a hearty dinner. In fact, it was used to stretch ground meat in patties or meatloaves, so a little meat went a long way. Cracked wheat doesn't enjoy the spotlight these days, but it's a staple in many cuisines around the world, and so its staying power is proven. It wasn't a trendy health food back in the 1930s. It was survival on a plate. Cracked wheat, chewy and cracked, tasted of resilience and making do with what you had in every bite. While we're on the topic of ham, this next dish added a fruity twist to it. Yep, we're talking about ham and banana hollandaise. Sweet banana, salty ham, and rich, creamy hollandaise sauce. Some might call it adventurous, others might call it a crime against food. This dish made a lot of buzz in the 1970s, and bananas have never appeared more out of their element ever since. It was featured in McCall's Great American Recipe Card collection in 1973 and took the world by storm due to its uniqueness. The hollandaise was a creamy sauce, first born in France and was originally known as sauce Isigny, named after a small town in Normandy famous for its butter and cream. This dish really proves that in a time of desperation, anyone will eat anything. But hey, at least it was memorable. When you hear about the way people lived in the war, you might sometimes hear about things like dried gnocchi, zucchini, or pasta. We just went over dried noodles, too. Stuff like that became just a bit more realistic to make regularly thanks to the resurgence of things like soy flour. See, the difference is, soy flour was made out of defatted soybeans. These soybeans have been roasted and put into a powder that makes them, for many reasons, exactly the kind of thing you would want during a war. Exactly because they're really good in terms of how much fiber they have. Besides just that, they also have an incredible amount of iron, calcium, and vitamins. It was exactly this kind of everyday nutrition that people were missing in their day. It was also leading to people experiencing levels of illness that they never had before. Soy flour helped alleviate things like this because it meant that people could have a healthy source of flour that they could also use for all kinds of cooking. It's hard to imagine something as simple as eggs without a chicken coop, but during the Great Depression, powdered eggs were a reality. These dehydrated wonders became a staple in American homes, providing a protein-rich solution that didn't spoil and didn't require refrigeration. Powdered eggs could sit on a pantry shelf for months, unlike fresh eggs, and that was a godsend for families facing uncertainty. When you mixed powdered eggs with water, you got something that was like scrambled eggs, kind of. Powdered eggs were bland and grainy, but when there were no other options, powdered eggs did the trick. They weren't just for breakfast. Home cooks used them in baked goods, soups, casseroles, and even puddings. Powdered eggs were versatile enough that even the least equipped kitchen could create quite a number of dishes without a single cluck in sight. Cheap powdered eggs were available, and they were a favorite item for government relief programs, which made them available to struggling families. Their utility extended beyond homes. Powdered eggs were shipped overseas to soldiers during World War II to make sure troops were nourished even in the most remote locations. Powdered eggs are now a must in emergency kits and camping supplies, but during the Great Depression, they were a sign of resilience. Meatloaf. Who doesn't love this classic comfort food? But what happens when you get a sweet craving and add a little twist to it? Well, you get meatloaf with brown sugar glaze. Meatloaf is a traditional German, Scandinavian, and Belgian dish, and it is a cousin to the meatball in Dutch cuisine. But a brown sugar glaze? That's where things got exciting. This dish was a culinary experiment of the Way days, and it's safe to say it was a huge success. Every continent came up with their own variations of this dinner, and it became a centerpiece at every dinner table. It was basically combining ground meat, breadcrumbs, and spices, topped with a caramelized brown sugar and ketchup glaze. What could go wrong with that? Meatloaf is still a staple for most people around the world, but you don't really see it get paired with a brown sugar glaze anymore. It was just a post-war craving, I guess. Now, this might surprise you, but powdered gelatin was genuinely also popular during the Second World War. This was essentially entirely due to the restriction on meats and fats, and how gelatin was used as a substitute in those scenarios. See, people needed fillers in their dishes badly, and gelatin just happened to be a really good one. You could also not cut too deeply into your dairy or meat reserves if you were relying on gelatin. A low-cost and stable product was perfect for the kind of life people were living during the war, and powdered gelatin was cheap too. People had also really begun relying on foraging and growing their own fruits, and a big way to make them taste and feel better as well as become heavier as a meal was to mix in gelatins and make salads out of them. Plus, fruit-flavored gelatin had also become really popular. Most families would try to make use of canned fruits too. It helped to put a bunch of really cheap and low-cost ingredients together for a fulfilling meal, rather than focusing too heavily on exhausting one ingredient and making it the centerpiece of your entire meal. Powdered milk was there to step in when fresh milk wasn't an option. Powdered milk was a marvel of food science, transforming surplus dairy into a shelf-stable product that didn't require refrigeration, a crucial feature for families without electric iceboxes during the Great Depression. Technically, a few scoops of powder whisked into the water made a liquid that resembled milk. The taste was more chalky than creamy, and the fresh stuff had a richer flavor. But powdered milk wasn't about luxury. It was about survival. It was a base for soups, sauces, and baked goods, making it one of the most versatile Depression-era pantry items. Families with children found powdered milk especially important because it meant kids got a steady supply of calcium and protein. even when fresh dairy was not available. It was also affordable, which meant it became a favorite among relief programs, which distributed it to struggling households. Powdered milk was a lifeline for families living far from the nearest dairy farm in rural areas where refrigeration was scarce. Today, powdered milk is used mostly for emergencies and backpacking trips, but it played a big role during the Great Depression. It was a symbol of ingenuity and resilience, taking something as simple as milk and turning it into a survival tool in a world of scarce resources. Liverwurst and onion sandwiches were once a lunchtime favorite. Liverwurst, or liver sausage, is a kind of sausage made from liver, so it was the perfect meal for when no part of the animal could go to waste. There were very limited meats available during the World Wars, and people had to use whatever they could find, including livers and hearts. Liverwurst was often spread thickly on rye bread and topped with thinly sliced onions. This sandwich was very popular in Europe and different parts of South America, such as Argentina and Chile. I don't know about you, but the combination of iron-rich liver and pungent onion doesn't sit right with me. It was like a flavor explosion in your mouth, but not in a good way. I'm pretty sure this sandwich was invented as a punishment, but people really had to make do with whatever they could find back in the day, and this dish was just a result of that experiment. So, here's a ration that was actually heavily politically charged as well. What do you think happens when you introduce canned sauerkraut, a heavily German meal, in a time when anti-German sentiment is soaring sky-high in the hearts and minds of the people? Some think this was a deliberate attempt by the American government to sway public opinion towards the takes they wanted, sort of a try at radicalizing them by reminding them who was responsible for their current state. To promote American unity, the government even tried to get people to start calling sauerkraut something entirely different. Now it was to be known as Liberty cabbage, and this was a way for them to take the parts of German culture that they liked while distancing people overall from the image of it that already existed. This was a European German meal, and that wasn't what they wanted it to look like because it was also a fantastic ration. Hence, you saw the term Liberty cabbage being plastered all over newspapers and ads, as well as packaging. Dried peas may be the wallflowers of the legume world, but they were the unsung heroes of many kitchens during the Great Depression. These little green powerhouses were tiny, nutrient-packed, and incredibly cheap, just the kind of food that families could stretch their food budgets as far as possible. In particular, split peas shone brightly as the star ingredient in hearty soups and stews. A handful of vegetables, maybe a scrap of salt pork, simmered with a pot of water made a meal that could warm bellies and spirits. The peas themselves were a solid dose of protein for those who couldn't afford meat and helped families stay nourished when times were tough. A near-infinite shelf life also came from dried peas. They could be stored in jars or cloth sacks and could last for years, making them a reliable choice for households that wanted to prepare for lean months. Peas were often grown by rural families, which dried and preserved them for the winter, or city dwellers went to market stalls to get their supply. Dried peas have been overshadowed by the flashier ingredient, but their legacy remains. They remind us that sometimes the simplest foods are the most dependable, feeding families through economic storms with a few handfuls of green perseverance. So besides just canned meat and the kinds of things people were out there hunting, there was also potted meat. What was potted meat? Good question, dear viewer. It's one I asked immediately, too. You actually make this by cooking some really well-grounded meat that was then repackaged, sealed, and sold in a jar or a can of fat and broth and jelly. Basically, it meant that people were able to get a long-lasting source of meat that could suit everyone's household. After all, not everyone was equipped and loaded with a fridge to work with. Not everyone had a basement that would get cold enough in the winters either. Stuff like potted meat, canned meat. All of this was essential because it applied to more or less everyone. Why was it called potted meat in specific, though? Well, when you would prepare this kind of meat, you would make a lot of use of a pot. It was common to put that meat into the pot and cover it with fat. Then you would seal it and preserve it. Things like these were how most families lived during the World War. For a generation that lived through the Depression, Saltine crackers were Depression-era superheroes in disguise as mere squares of humdrum dough. Saltines stretched scarce ingredients further, providing the fill-in-the-gaps when bread, flour, or even meat ran short. Break them into milk for breakfast? Done. Canned goods? Layer them with them for a makeshift casserole? Absolutely. A rare treat. Toast them with cheese? Heaven on a plate. Saltines were cheap, long-lasting, and endlessly useful, so families stockpiled them. Because they were shelf-stable, they stayed fresh for months, a game-changer when grocery trips were out of the question. Saltines were also a change in texture and flavor from food that got monotonous, which was often the case during the Depression. They were neutral, so whatever was on hand could be put on them. Peanut butter, jelly, or leftover gravy. Today, they're often overshadowed by their fancier cracker cousins, but saltines still have a nostalgic charm. In the 1930s, they were more than a snack. They were a survival tool, and sometimes the simplest things were the biggest things. Canned coconut milk was also really one of the best kinds of things you could ever get. Whether you wanted to use it for baking, for making savory dishes, or just salvaging that bread pudding, it was one of the most convenient things people had access to. Canned coconut milk was also a side effect of all the different kinds of trade opportunities that were opening up for America, thanks to their new prospects with the Pacific at the time. You know, despite what the war period would have you believe, loving thy neighbor is still the best way to live. Also, canned coconut milk was a fantastic alternative to the use of dairy, which was something people were really desperately trying to avoid. Along with germ and turnips, it made up the bulk of the basic kinds of things people were eating throughout this rough period. Canned coconut milk was also a part of the larger efforts of the government to keep nutrition somewhat manageable throughout this time. The back-to-back effects of the recession and the Dust Bowl on top of the Second World War, people were really struggling badly to keep up with their health in this time. Coconut milk was something you could literally prepare on an open fire too, which meant that it was really manageable for everyone to handle. You wanted things that required the least amount of kitchen appliances possible during a time like this. It meant that it was a lot more applicable to the places that were struck the hardest by everything going on in the country at the time of the 1930s. Creamed chipped beef on toast, often referred to as SOS, was a popular military meal that made its way into civilian kitchens. Now, this one was equal parts comforting and questionable. Think of it as dried beef, reconstituted into a creamy, salty sauce, and then plopped on top of toast. It's like someone tried to make a fancy grilled cheese, but accidentally ended up in the Weird Food Hall of Fame. I'm not saying it's bad, but it's definitely a unique flavor profile. It was also known as fizzled beef and was served as breakfast in many diners across the US during the post-war days. And it wasn't just limited to toast. Chipped beef was also often served on bagels, English muffins, biscuits, home fries, rice, mashed potato, and in casserole. Some people even tried flavoring it with Worcestershire sauce. Yeah, now we're talking. This one's faded from our dinner tables but hasn't been able to escape our memories just yet. Speaking of good replacements, canned chicory roots were a really good substitute for sweet coffee. Since the lack of sugar meant that most people focused on preserving their sugar rather than spending it on tea for its herbal prose or the benefits of caffeine, and because most people wanted to sleep the days away, people stopped drinking it as much. Plus, disruptions in the global and domestic supply of coffee thanks to the war made sure that there was ample enough room in people's everyday lives for canned chicory roots. Coffee was still a big part of daily life for lots of Americans. Don't get me wrong. It was just as necessary as anything else, but people just couldn't be wasting their sugar on it. They still needed it in some shape or form, though, and the rations on coffee put in place by the government weren't helpful. Between the 30s and 40s, coffee's price went up badly too. Combined with the sugar, it just meant that it was too expensive of a cost to make a cup of joe. Canned chicory roots were able to take advantage of this by almost perfectly imitating the feeling of coffee, being a local substitute, and being pretty inexpensive. During the Great Depression, canned tomatoes were the unsung heroes, adding a splash of color and flavor to a drab dinner table. These little cans of sunshine were lifesavers, turning even the blandest of meals into something you could eat. Canned tomatoes were the Depression-era kitchen's MVP, the versatile ingredient that could be used in soups and stews, sauces and casseroles. Cheap, easy to store, and full of enough acid and flavor to perk up just about anything, including your spirits, they were. There was more to tomatoes than taste. They were nutritional powerhouses. They were high in vitamin C and helped keep scurvy at bay when fresh fruits were unavailable. And, because they had a long shelf life, families could stockpile them without fear of spoilage. Families also canned tomatoes from their gardens to last them through the winter. Rows of gleaming mason jars in a cellar, each holding the promise of a warm, flavorful meal when times got tough, wasn't unusual. Canned tomatoes are still pantry staples today, but we might forget how simple they are. They weren't just a convenience back in the Depression, they were a lifeline. And sometimes the smallest luxuries can be the biggest. So jellied consommé is a clear soup set in gelatin. It is made from richly flavored stock or broth that has been clarified, which is a process that uses egg whites to remove fat. So not only does it taste good, but it's healthy too. It's like someone decided to turn soup into a science experiment. This strange soup originated in the UK and has many variations, including double consommé, which is basically the same recipe with twice the amount of meat used. This dish was all the rage back in the day, probably because people thought it looked fancy. But let's be real, it's more like a horror movie prop than a food. Can you imagine slurping up that wobbly, gelatinous broth? I'm not sure my stomach could handle it. And that's probably the reason why we don't see this one on our dinner tables anymore. You could say the same for lots of things that were made popular during the war, for example, dried noodles. This was a staple that worked really well in many different places thanks to the really long lifespan of dried noodles. They're also just as easy to store as bouillon cubes and pretty cost-efficient if you think about it. All it took to gather the ingredients to make stuff like this from scratch was a few cents. It helped people restore a sense of normalcy if you ask lots of food analysts and historians. People always were used to eating spaghetti and meatballs, noodles and pastas, dishes like that since they were teenagers. It helped people relive some of the days they were used to before the constant war efforts took over the scope of their everyday lives. Plus, people often used bouillon cubes along with their dried noodles. It was things like that, which when people put together one by one, eventually started to look like something resembling a real plate of food, and that meant a lot at the time. The underdog of the Great Depression pantry was turnips, the scrappy little root vegetable that was always at every table. Turnips, with their peppery bite and rock-bottom price, became the saving grace for families who were stretching every penny. Turnips were not just a root to roast, mash, or toss into soups, but a kitchen multitasker. So many families stockpiled turnips during those lean years because they could turn a bare-bones meal into something hearty and comforting with just one turnip. Poor soil was no problem for turnips, which made them a good crop for struggling farmers. In a root cellar, they could last for months without spoiling, making them ideal for winter when other fresh vegetables were long gone. But creative cooks came up with ways to bake them into casseroles, pair them with potatoes to stretch a mash further, or pickle them for a tangy treat. Sweetened turnip puddings, for instance, surprised many with their richness. Even desserts weren't off limits. Turnips aren't a staple of the grocery cart these days, but they've worked their way into farm-to-table menus and rustic recipes. They weren't a trendy choice back then, but they survived in vegetable form. Speaking of influences from different cultures, lots of Americans began to take a lot of advantage of pemmican. This was typically something that was always a Native American food, and it had a massive part to play in how people were going to be eating during the Second World War. Its use was a bit niche, and it was definitely heavily regional. If you weren't living in the right place, such as the western parts of America and the South, you would almost never encounter this. The US military had the opposite experience with pemmican, on the other hand. They wanted food that was high-calorie and easy to carry around, and this is exactly what pemmican was like. It was typically made by drying bison, which have an extreme importance in Native American culture. It was very important for bison populations to be treated with respect, but the over-reliance on pemmican meant that they were also farmed and butchered more than they usually ever would have been. However, this also meant that traditional pemmican was the perfect thing to eat during the war. Dried navy beans are the perfect meal when you're on a budget and want something filling and endlessly adaptable. These humble legumes were a lifesaver during the Great Depression, when meat was out of reach, providing protein and sustenance. Their small size and mild flavor made them a good base for soups and stews, baked beans, and bean patties. Navy beans were ridiculously economical as well. That single bag could feed a family for days, especially if you add rice, cornbread, or whatever odds and ends were in the pantry. They lasted practically forever on the shelf, and that made them an excellent stockpile item for lean times. The best part? These little powerhouses were nutritional dynamos, packed with fiber, protein, and iron, just what you needed to keep energy up when work was hard and food was scarce. Navy beans were transformed into savory dishes seasoned with salt pork and sweetened bean pies that were surprisingly tasty. They weren't exactly exciting, but they were reliable, and that's what mattered. Navy beans are still a staple in many kitchens today, but back then they were a symbol of survival. Depression-era families depended on them, simple, sturdy, and essential, one bowl at a time. Tap like if you felt that history in your bones and subscribe so you do not miss the next bite of the past.